Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to another wonderful Tuesday evening session. We were just talking about how wonderful, we had a really special book club meeting. There's a book club of Arab women who are all connected to Harvard University that we met with over the weekend. They were reading the Sheikh's book, Reasoning with God. And we're just delighted to have a chance to ask questions and talk to him about things that he raised in his book. The thing that was just so striking and so hopeful, like we talk about a lot of things here that sort of make us sad or depressed or frustrated, things in the Muslim world. So it's such a beautiful inspirational time when you meet really smart women. And these were like PhDs, doctors, people who had all either graduated from Harvard or were currently at Harvard, from all around the world. They, interestingly, all had a Kuwait connection, and they, connected with the professor on that because the professor, was born and raised in Kuwait for a large amount of his life. And what was so hopeful is that you have these incredibly smart, thoughtful, committed women who are just looking for, an Islam that touches their heart and that makes sense. And so they were so excited to engage with Reasoning with God, which is already a really difficult book, a very dense book, but very, I think, for them, both challenging and hopeful. And they were so excited to engage, the Sheikh with, really good questions. And I think from, and they follow the Usuli Institute. Some of them had just learned about the Usuli Institute. But the thing that's just most exciting is that there are people that still really care and that really are looking for an intellectual, spiritual, soulful connection with their faith. They hear things, they see things that don't jive with what they imagine their faith to be. So when they discover a work like Reasoning with God, it gives them hope, and then it gives us hope because it just makes it feel, as the Sheikh said, oh my God, someone's listening, someone's reading, someone's out there. And so it was a really rejuvenating experience. So, I recorded it. I would have to get permission to share it, but I just wanted to convey that it was a very, I think, energizing and hopeful session. So that was really lovely. And then, interestingly, I didn't really have a lot to prepare to share today, except that I thought, kind of on the other end, everyone gets tests. Really, sometimes the tests are difficult. Sometimes they're not that bad, and sometimes they rise to the level of just earth-shattering. Like the Sheikh has called them zalzalas, which means earthquake, in your life, and it's part of living life. And you have different things that come in, and they're lessons. And so we get tested all the time, and I think especially as we're doing the Quran halaqas, daily we get tests, and we just recently got a zalzala. I think maybe not quite to the level of zalzala, but close. And it's like they're always tests. I think that they're just reminders that it's, I think, one, that God cares, because the more difficult the test, the more opportunity to grow and look inside of you and see what you need to change and see what you can do to improve. And it gives you a chance to look back on the other tests in your life in the past that were full of pain, but that led to growth. And I think that if you're on this path to the divine, you have to trust that this is part of the plan. And that a lot of times when you're in the midst of a really difficult test, it's so painful, you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But when you pass it and you look back, you see the value of it and how, why it was so important for you to go through it. And hopefully, if you handle the test properly, you look for the learning and you look for how to change, and you recognize that when you turn to God for comfort and for help, that's the fastest way, I think, through the test. And that we know from our tradition, every year you're going to get some pretty difficult tests. But when you stop getting those tests is when you have to be concerned, because then that's when God is like, okay, fine, I'll let you be, to whatever you want. But anyway, just to say that, you know, everyone goes through it, and I think you can test your level of patience and test your level of calm and ability to turn to God with every test, and hopefully that reflex to turn to God will become more immediate, you know, more certain, more you know, strong with every test. And inshallah, you know, we're all in it together, and that, you know, please pray for us, and let's all stay together and stay on this journey forward and grow. So that's it. I'm looking forward to another amazing session. So,
what is the email about Surah Al-Najm?
oh, okay. I'll pull it up.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه واتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري وأجرني في مصيبتي يا رب العالمين واخلف علي بخير منها. لا إله إلا أنت أنت العلي العظيم. Before the surah, inshallah, for today is Surah Al-Qiyamah. But before we start with Surah Al-Qiyamah, I got a message about Surah Al-Najm that I wanted to share with you. Is it Steve Conley who sent it?
That name sounds familiar. I don't know where Grace went, but that name sounds familiar. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to read it because he points out to certain things about Surah Al-Najm. Assalamu alaikum to you and your family. Okay. One point which I'm not sure the professor is aware of concerning the surah, note the significance of ayah number 46. It is the name. It is the same as the number of chromosomes, 46, in which human cells except the sex cells, due to the conjoining of DNA from the sperm, contributing 23 chromosomes, an egg contributing the other 23 chromosomes when they meet and fuse together during fertilization. It is the sex chromosome, X or Y, carried by the sperm, not the egg, which determines the sex of the child. And this fact is alluded to in the particular ayah concerned. So the information contained in the ayah predates the scientific understanding of where the sex of the child originates. Additionally, note that the atoms which make up humans originate in stars, which is consonant with the name of the chapter An-Najm. Okay, so this is, we had a message before in a different surah, also pointing out one of the scientific miracles of the Quran. I, of course, have heard before about the, I'm aware of the theory that human beings seem to have been created of stardust. But I usually don't cover the scientific material because it's not my field, and I'm not very comfortable speaking about things that I don't have mastery of, even if I, have familiarity with it. But this is very interesting. So that in Surah Al-Najm, according to this message, that it accurately identifies what determines the sex of the child. And of course, that centuries before that becomes. And there, of course, I mean, I've said this before, although I'm not an expert in scientific miracles of the Quran, so I don't discuss these issues, but I think that you have to be very obstinate and pig-headed to ignore the scientific miracles of the Quran. I mean, there's just so many of them, and so many of them are so compelling that you need to be just very stubborn and to refuse to accept them. Okay, and people, when if you find that I've missed things like this, yeah, please do feel free to write me. It's for the benefit of all. So Surah Al-Qiyamah is an early Meccan revelation. In order of revelation, it is most certainly among the early or low 30s. So, I mean, and in fact, probably it was surah number 30 or 31. And as one of the very early revelations, so it is an anchoring surah. It sets the pace for so much of what will come later. And we know that it was from the very beginning of Islam an often recited surah. So there are many different hadiths that talk about the importance of reciting Surah Al-Qiyamah. And some, talk about that you should recite it at least every night, and so on. But these traditions are of a particular genre. What they collectively point to is the importance of the surah and the centrality of the role that it played in the early Islamic message. So obviously it was cited, it was revealed after Al-Fatiha, it was revealed after Ikhlas, the cornerstone surahs like that. But it was also revealed after Al-Najm, it was revealed after Abasa, two surahs we talked about. It was revealed after Al-Buruj, another surah we talked about. In the old tafsir I've done, in the not part of the Ulum project, but the earlier tafsir, I've covered surahs like At-Tin and Al-Shams and Al-Qadr, all of which were revealed before Surah Al-Qiyamah. And Surah Al-Qiyamah is likely revealed right after Surah Al-Qari'ah, and right before Surah Al-Humazah, وَيْلٌ لِكُلِّ هُمَزَةٍ لُمَزَةٍ, which I believe I've covered in the old tafsir, before Project Illumine. Did I ever cover Qara?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, so I covered both Qara and Al-Humazah. Now, as we will see, it is it's a nuanced surah, and it's one of these surah that makes me pause and take a deep breath before I engage it, because you're always concerned about doing it justice. And that none of the layers sort of escape you or slip out of your hand as you take this Quranic narrative on. Okay, so let's start. لا أقسم بيوم القيامة. In the study Quran, it says, I swear by the day of resurrection. What's really interesting is that there is in the Islamic tradition a discussion as to whether it is theologically appropriate for Allah to swear by the day of resurrection. And it's much of the discussion is just has the earmarks of the old philosophical system, very much influenced by Greek philosophy. So we're not going to talk about a lot of it. But there is this whole back and forth. When Allah says Yawm al-Qiyamah, is Allah referring to the day of resurrection? And whether you say yes or no, it depends on whether you think that the day of resurrection is something that Allah would swear by. The majority reach the reasonable decision that yes, it is possible that Allah would swear by the day of resurrection, but that we must understand Yawm al-Qiyamah in its many nuances. So, on the one hand, Allah is underscoring, لا أقسم بيوم القيامة, putting the day of resurrection right in the center of things, in the affairs of your heart, in the affairs of your life, as we will see. But Yawm al-Qiyamah, as many have argued, and as the thrust of the Surah seems to indicate, is also the monumental day of transition. It is the day where, and we'll see why in more detail, it's the day where you transition from this life to the next life. It is, and then it becomes rather fascinating that it is described as Yawm al-Qiyamah, because it is literally you are falling in one life, but you are rising in another life. Sufi-esque tafsirs said, yes, it is appropriate to understand it as the day of resurrection and also to understand it as the day of transition. But we see in Yawm al-Qiyamah a meaning that is driven by the text of the surah itself. And that is the day that you are able to lift the veil and see the truth of your existence. And that, as a moral value, is something that Allah swears by. Now, there are a lot of sources that tell you you have to choose one or the other. I don't believe you do. I think it is perfectly legitimate to see these as layers in meaning, as we'll show. Okay. A big part of the discussion is لا أقسم بيوم القيامة ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة. The study Quran translates it, and I swear by the blaming soul. Now, النفس اللوامة, there is a grammatical construction here, ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة, that gives rise to an interesting discussion. I'm not going to go through the grammar because I know that will alienate most. But whether the grammar means that Allah is saying, I swear by the day of Qiyamah, but I do not swear by an-nafs al-lawama, the blaming soul, or is it that Allah is saying, I swear by the day of Qiyamah and I swear by the day blaming soul? And depending on how you end up resolving the grammatical debate, you either end up believing that Allah does swear by the blaming soul or does not swear by the blaming soul. Make a long story short, I believe that I'm among those who resolve the grammatical debate by saying that Allah does swear by the blaming soul, and that it makes perfect sense, and in fact it is not incorrect grammatically, as some have argued that Allah would use it's a construction, wala uqsimu, wala uqsimu. That is the grammatical rub, if you will. Okay, so but then this, Allah swears by what Allah creates. Allah swears by the sun, by the moon, by the stars. Allah swears by physical objects of nature that are observable, in a way empirically verifiable. But here Allah is swearing by a day that is part of alam al-ghayb, the world of the unseen. It is not empirical, not until it happens. Not until it happens. It's not empirical right now. And Allah swears by a type of personality. This gave Muslim interpreters a very long pause. Because part of the question, what is the nafs al-lawama? What is this thing that is worth the Almighty swearing by? Well, if you say it is the blaming soul, well, that just begs other set of questions. Because a soul that blames, it could be a soul that blames others but doesn't blame itself. It could be a soul that observes the faults of others but doesn't observe its own faults. It could be a soul that doesn't engage in any self-blame in life of this earth, but upon meeting its accountability in the final day, it starts blaming itself. But then that's a product of fear. Why swear by that? Or it could be a soul that is introspective and constantly looking at its own faults. But if so, how do we know that this blaming soul doesn't get to the point of paranoia where it is no longer just towards the self? So, as I've often told you, our ancestors used to take the Quran far more seriously than we do. So our ancestors had very long and intense debates about these things. And debates doesn't mean that they're shooting, from their hip. They're studying grammar, they're studying history, they're studying the linguistic usage, and so on and so forth, to try to squeeze out what Allah is saying to us and the way that Allah is talking to us. And what emerges from this debate and what eventually became the majority or the predominant position is that Allah is actually not putting the focus on a priori on Yawm al-Qiyamah, but actually Allah is putting the focus a priori on al-Nafs al-Lawwama. And Allah is saying, study the process by which the nafs, the self, engages in accountability. Allah is telling us several things at the same time. Some of you, as the Arabic says, some of you I'm not going to read the Arabic. Some of you, the way you engage in blame is in fact, you notice the fault, you notice a faulty action when committed by others, but you are incapable of seeing yourself doing the same. And so, you might have a conscience, but your conscience, in fact, as a moralistic conscience, it is a highly selective conscience that consistently drags you into the abyss of hypocrisy. In our human experience, I mean, maybe colonialism would be a best example of that, right? You talk democracy, you talk human rights, but you're oppressing people in the name of democracy and human rights. And some of you simply cannot confront yourself. You don't judge others, but you don't judge yourself either. Your entire life is a life of avoidance. You avoid self-confrontation, you avoid confrontation with others, You avoid confrontation, period. So your entire life is a bland state. And then there is a different nafs al-lawama, the one that is constantly taking a moral inventory of itself, period. Moral inventory of what it says and what it does, what it thinks. So there is the nafs al-lawama with its many variants, and there is the yawm al-Qiyamah. The variants and now yawm al-Qiyamah, as we said, could be of three types or three nuances. How does the different forms of nafs al-lawama will fare? How will they fare in the day of resurrection? How will the different forms of nafs al-lawama fare in the day of transformation, meaning transition from this life to the other? And how will the different forms of nafs al-lawama fare in relation to the possibility of enlightenment? So the first step is for you, and this is remarkably, the Quran is like inviting you to concepts. But putting the onus on you to think through what you need to think through. Which is something the Quran often does, because you need believers in the Quran to be thinking, analytical people, not robots. Not cattle. So, what type of nafs al-lawama do you have? Do you have a nafs al-lawama? To put it bluntly, but so many theologians will argue like whether it is possible for a human being to exist without a nafs al-lawama. But let's just say, do you have a nafs al-lawama? And if you don't, you're in trouble. Then you are spineless, tasteless, odorless. You're nothing. You don't take position on anything. And if you do, what type of a nafs al-lawama is it? Is it directed outwards or inwards? And depending on how you understand that nafs al-lawama, how do you see yourself faring at these three different levels? Resurrection, transformation, and enlightenment, as we said. Okay. So, then, this rhetorical question that the Quran presents us with, أيحسب الإنسان أن لن نجمع عظامه بلى قادرين على أن نسوي بنانه بل يريد الإنسان ليفجر أمامه. Right away, it presents us with this rhetorical question human beings think that we cannot gather their bones? Nay, but we are in fact able to fashion their fingers and toes, banana, we'll talk about banana in a second. بل يريد الإنسان ليفجر أمامه. The study Quran translates it as, but man desires to defile what lies before him. Well, okay, we'll see. We'll come to it. It's not, yeah. Okay, so how, what is it saying, and how does it connect? So first, that rhetorical question: don't you think Allah can gather your bones again? Obviously, the rhetorical question is directed at the ultimate issue. Is it resurrection? Interestingly, the answer is not necessarily resurrection. The issue is consequence. You see, the Quran insists that life without consequence, without accountability, has no meaning. If you exist and perish, and that is it, there is no meaning for your entire existence, regardless of how much you pretend there is. The only thing that gives meaning is the fact that there are consequences. There's accountability. Why is this an important point? Because there's an interesting debate about gather their bones. A number of theologians said that gather their bones is just a euphemism for bringing back human beings to accountability. But in fact, there is no reason to believe that your bones will in fact be assembled for resurrection. You know, if you've had, I don't know, a bone with a metal, what do you call these metal things that doctors put in your bones?
Prosthetic.
Yeah, prosthetic thing, right? There's no reason to believe that, you know, your bone with the prosthetic is gonna come back. But that what comes back is al-anfus al-rawhaniyya, that it is the soul. So it's a euphemism for the recreation of who you are, but not necessarily the bones. Of course, as you can probably guess, the more literalists, the Ahl al-Hadith especially, said no, God gathers the bones. What is most fascinating and what is this expression, بَلَا قَادِرِينَ عَلَىٰ أَن نُسَوِّيَ بَنَانَ. Because banana doesn't necessarily mean fingers and toes. It could mean two of one things. Well, it could mean one of three things. It could mean fingers and toes, but it could mean I can bring you back with extremities that look very different, because banan is usually what animals have, hooves and whatever. But three, it could mean I will bring you back from your most basic and intricate elements. So people who do the scientific miracles of the Quran, when they studied banan, they said, banan is a reference to, in Arabic language, it's reference to the most basic elements of life, like chromosomes and DNA codes. And so if you again, I'm not an expert in it, so I don't like to deal with anything that I'm not absolutely confident about in terms of expertise. But you'll find a lot written about that, and you could look it up, about the reference to Bala Qadirina ala an nusawiya banana, and whether that, centuries before we discovered DNA, the Quran is talking about DNA. Okay. بل يريد الإنسان ليفجر أمامه. The study Quran says humans desire to defile what lies before them. But that's an odd translation, isn't it? Is it really the Quran saying that humans want to defile what is in front of them? Is there any other translation? I'm just curious.
Muhammad Assad says, man chooses to deny what lies ahead of him.
Ah, okay. Anyone else?
In Tafsir Mizan, it's rather man wishes to sin ahead of him, other than before.
It's interesting because all of them are like touching upon the core of it, or parts of it. لِيَنْظُرْ أَمَامَ it's like saying man thinks of the future and thinks that the future gives, or humans think that the future is far enough removed that they have time to sin. If you really, the essence of that expression is that humans are, it's not like they want to defile what lies ahead of them. It is human beings are led astray by their hopefulness, that they get tempted, they want to have fun, and they delay thinking about the consequences. This is really important because the way Surah Al-Qiyamah is going to talk about death. That if human beings really thought about how quickly everything is going to come to pass, they would realize that just because they have 50 years ahead of them, 20 years ahead of them, but even human beings, as I pointed out, actually, is that, they quite often human beings will say, I will sin now and repent later. But لينظر أمام, that human beings in يؤخر التوبة ويقدم المعصية is the Arabic expression. And so the human beings, the tendency that human beings have to say is that, say, well, I still have time to repent. I still have time to repent. But as has been noted by so many, that the longer you do something wrong, repentance actually never comes. the more something becomes a habit, the harder it is, and eventually what happens is that instead of repenting, you philosophize whatever wrongdoing you're committing, so that you convince yourself you don't need to repent after all. That in the vast majority of situations, this type of plan that, well, it's okay, you know, I'm still young, I can fix it later in my life, doesn't work the way you think it will. And so in this one short sentence, subhanAllah, Allah just gets to the core of something within human psychology, that on the one hand, say, do you have a conscientious self? But let me tell you the biggest challenge that the conscientious self has. What is the biggest challenge, Allah? The biggest challenge is بَلْ يُرِيدُ الْإِنسَانُ لِيَفْجَرُ أَمَامَهُ, that human beings are always saying, it's okay, I have time, I have circumstances. They accommodate themselves. يَسْأَلُ أَيَّانَ يَوْمُ الْقِيَامَةِ, asking when is the day of resurrection. The temptation is when you read this, يَسْأَلُ أَيَّانَ يَوْمُ الْقِيَامَةِ, asking when is the day of resurrection, you say, oh, it's talking about unbelievers who are saying, when is the day of resurrection? Is there a day of resurrection? No, it's not. It is talking about, yes, unbelievers, but also believers who, because the day of resurrection is so remote, they don't think of it as an immediate possibility. And they don't think in concrete terms of being confronted by it in any immediate sense. So that takes us back, بَلْ يُرِيدُ الْإِنسَانُ لِيَفْجُرَ أَمَامَهُ, that habit of sinning now and I'll worry about it later. It's the same dynamic. It is as if your inner self is saying, well, the day of resurrection is not going to be tomorrow. You know, I still have time to have my wedding and do whatever baboos stuff I want to do in my wedding, as a lot of people do. You know, the day of resurrection is not going to be next week. I still have time to go out with my friend and do all the baboo stuff I want to do. That's يَسْأَلُ أَيَّانَ يَوْمُ الْقِيَامَةِ. The day of resurrection, you know, is not going to be before my kids graduate, so if it's okay if I take the bribe and fund their school. I have time. That's what it's talking about. Okay. Then Surah Al-Qiyamah takes you to this remarkable gear shift. فإذا برق البصر وخسف القمر وجمع الشمس والقمر يقول الإنسان يومئذ أين المفر. So when the eyes are dazzled and the moon is eclipsed, this is the study Quran, and the sun and the moon are brought together, that day humans will say, where is the escape? Now, at the most basic level, you'd read this and say, well, it's talking about the final day. That's the day where, you're going to have all these things happening. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it says, well, if it starts out with إِذَا بَرِقَ الْبَصَرُ, and this actually becomes really important. The eyes are dazzled. The words here, بَرِقَ الْبَصَرُ, then followed by these descriptions of what happens to the sun and the moon, and then this odd expression of the moon and the sun are gathered. So of course the literalists say, well, okay, the sun and moon will be gathered, and in fact, according to Al-Hadith, the sun and moon will be gathered together, and both of them will be thrown in hell to burn in hell, so that hell can be hotter for the kuffar. These are riwayat that they have in there. But everyone else had, one, they said that the Arabic here does not lead us to believe that, in fact, the sun or moon are going to go anywhere. It is the perception of the sun, our ability to see the sun and moon is what is going to be affected. So for instance, in Maturidi says, فإذا برق البصر وخسف القمر يخرج على التمثيل وليس على التحقيق ولذلك فهو معناه إذا دهش بصره وتحير. So he's saying that it is not, if you look at the Arabic, Allah is not saying that I will do anything to the sun and moon, but that your perception of the sun and moon is what is important, and your ability to see the sun and moon will be very different, and that whatever is going to happen in the atmosphere, in the heavens of the earth, it's going to shock you. And that fits with the day of resurrection narrative, which is وَلَا أُقْسِمُ بِيَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ, i.e. the day of resurrection. Second perspective. Second perspective said, well, if you look at the Arabic, it is talking about a time where you as a human being will no longer be able to see the sun and moon as they are. A process of transformation where you will stare in the you'll stare in open space, but you'll see nothing. And they said that is exactly a description of the process of death. That empty, blank gaze that people get as they're dying. And they say a lot about that with in much greater detail. The Sufi-esque tafsirs said, again, the sun and moon are symbols for your relationship to enlightenment. Either your eyesight, meaning your soul and your intellect, will develop so that you can see the reality of things for what they are, or they will atrophy. So it is as if you see the sun in the middle of the sky, but you don't really see it. Especially that the Quran says, وَخَسَفَ الْقَمَرُ. خُسُوف الْقَمَرِ means the utter disappearance of the moon from the sky. A kusuf is the partial disappearance of the moon. Khusuf is complete disappearance of the moon, completely dark sky. Kusuf, with a kaf instead of a kha, is partial. So for Sufis, they're saying the issue is whether you become submerged in total darkness. Just so you know, for instance, they also talk about فإذا برق البصر أتحير ودهش شاخصا من فزع الموت وخسف القمر أي قمر القلب لذهاب نور العقل عنه وجمع شمس الروح وقمر القلب. They take the shams and the qamar as the moon of the heart and the sun of the soul. And the point is that where are you going with your inner self, with this nafs al-lawama, as we will see. Yeah, so here, this is another passage, might as well. والقمر كناية عن ذهاب الروح إلى عالم الآخرة كأن الآخرة كالشمس فإنه يظهر فيها المغيبات وتتضح فيها المبهمات والروح كالقمر فإنه كما أن القمر يقبل النور من الشمس فكذا الروح تقبل نور المعارف من عالم الآخرة ولا شك أن تفسير هذه الآيات بعلامات القيامة أولى من تفسيرها بعلامات الموت وأشد مطابقة لها. So I mean, just examples of what you find in the tradition of the debates about how do you understand these references. But all of these debates come from the Quranic usage of Arabic itself. Now, so whether you are confronted with the day of resurrection or you are confronted with the day of truth, the day of your death and transformation, or you are confronted with the reality of either your submersion in the darkness of like as if a moonless existence, or you are pleased to know that you have actually elevated yourself to some illuminated existence. The crux is that moment when human beings will come and confront this essential question. يقول الإنسان يومئذ أين المفر. Human beings confronted with a pivotal turning point and crisis. And the question that will come to them is, to where do I turn? What venues of relief and escape is available to me? كلا لا وزر. لا وزر does not mean there is no refuge, but it's like saying there are no options. Don't kid yourself. There are no options. إلى ربك المستقر. There are no options except one. إلى ربك المستقر. المستقر is remarkable expression because it is not just your dwelling is with your Lord, but your end, your settlement. It's like when I say to you, when we say about stability, it's called istiqrar, right? Headquarters is maqar. If you say I've settled on a matter, you say استقررت على الأمر. So إلى ربك يومئذ المستقر. Always go to one ultimate reality, and that is the reality of your Lord. There is no way around that, regardless of what type of nafs al-lawama you have. Whether you have the conscientious type or you have the lousy type, you are all heading to the same place. And when you are with your Lord, you will be confronted with your record. That is a staple issue. Now the Sufi-esque tafsirs point out that it is short-sighted to believe that al-mustaqar ma'allah, that the realizing that all roads lead to Allah, it is short-sighted to think that this only becomes apparent upon resurrection or upon death. But in fact, this is the reality even in our life. But we often refuse to acknowledge it. Let's take a 2-minute break because I am trying to convince myself I'm doing a good job with this surah. I don't feel I am, but so let's take a 2-minute break. I'll go give myself a little pep talk. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, just I want to underscore, it is remarkable that at the time that these tafsir are often written, that they had the presence of mind to conclude that when Allah says Jumu'a ash-shams wal qamar, of course, you know, you have the literalists who said that means Allah will take the sun and the moon and throw them in hell. But you also had so many scholars who say things like أن يذهب سلطانهما فلا يعملان عملهما وليس على الحقيقة. That means that Allah is not actually going to grab the sun and moon, but that Allah will alter the function of the sun and moon on earth. And this is remarkably developed, mature thought. Okay. Just so you know, when Allah says "Kalla la wazar," which we said that no, there will be no refuge. Wazar, this is an old Arabic expression that al-wazar is actually a strong mountain. That's what wazar means. And so when Allah says kalla la wazar, it's that's why it means no, there are no options. It's idiomatic. Okay. So where did we leave off? Yeah. كلا لا وزر إلى ربك يومئذ المستقر ينبأ الإنسان يومئذ بما قدم وأخر. So fate, all heads, all ways lead to Allah and to your accountability, which, as we said, is the meaning of existence. But then this remarkable discourse in Surah Al-Qiyamah. بل الإنسان على نفسه بصيرة ولو ألقى معاذيره. Let's see what the study Quran translated. This is 14. Indeed, man shall be a testimony against himself, though he proffers excuses. Yeah, I thought that would happen. Okay. بل الإنسان على نفسه بصيرة is much more subtle than that and remarkable. It's ولو ألقى معاذيره. It's like telling you this. I know that you are full of excuses. This is ولو ألقى معاذيره. بل الإنسان على نفسه بصيرة is like telling you, but I also know that you know whether you're a good person or not. It is remarkable. It's like saying, cut the BS. And elsewhere, the Quran, Allah says, that human beings are very argumentative. They know how to come up with all types of reasons for why they don't do the right thing. And they don't assign blame correctly. But I'm saying, in so many cases, the truth is known to you. Then, at this point, the Quran then introduces what could be a real surprise, because suddenly it tells you from there, it goes into لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه ثم إن علينا بيانه. So suddenly it's talking about the Quran itself, and it's saying, don't speed through the Quran. Don't read through the Quran like a bullet or, with speed. In fact, this is 17. Allah is saying that it is upon us to collect the Quran, because as we know, the Quran was written in parchments. And then after collecting, and when we say inna alayna, it's here, the alayna is to Allah and the Prophet. So collect the Quran, recite the Quran, after it told you don't do it, don't speed through it, then follow the Quran ثم إن علينا بيانه. Bayana is not explain it. Bayana is understand it. It's like saying internalize it. Bayan al-shay is when you unpack something and understand its essence. So you pause here for a second and you say, hold on, so wait. We started out by talking about this day. And then the self. This critical, self-critical self, or critical self, the self that criticizes others or criticizes itself. And then a warning about the transitions, either transition to the final day, transition to death, transitions in life, but that big moral fallacy that I have time and it's okay if I'm not doing the right thing now because I'll fix it tomorrow. And that stern warning that, everything is to God, and if you're lousy, you know you're lousy. And then it's telling us to read the Quran very carefully and not go through the Quran with haste. I should mention, just for your edification, that in the tradition you'll find people who say, oh, these verses, they were telling the Prophet that Gabriel would Gabriel come to the Prophet, Gabriel would recite the ayat, the verses to the Prophet, and then the Prophet, anxious not to forget anything, would start repeating after Gabriel very quickly, and Allah was telling the Prophet, stop repeating after Gabriel very quickly, just let Gabriel finish with the entire surah and then you can study it. I've looked at these reports, I looked at their chains of transmissions, they're extremely unreliable. But you'll find them, I've even heard them in some Islamic centers taught to kids, although they have no basis. But the essence of it is that, again, and we saw this before, Allah wants us to ponder and reflect upon the Quran. Now, I bear with me. I'm going to share with you on this point of inna alayna bayana, that we must understand it. I'm going to share with you a quote from the tradition that I'll try to paraphrase, because part of what we're doing is to understand also how rich our tradition is. So here, this is he's commenting on ثم إن علينا بيانه. So he says, فله talking about Allah, فالله له ملك وملكوت لقوله تعالى بيده ملكوت كل شيء والقرآن أشرف الأشياء وأكملها فله أيضا ملك وملكوت فأما ملكه فهو الأحكام والشرائع الظاهرة التي تتعلق بمصالح الأمة من العبادات المالية والبدنية والجنايات والوصايات والأمثالها. أما ملكوته فهو الأسرار الإلهية والحقائق اللاهوتية التي تتعلق ببواطن خواص الأمة وأخص الخواص بل بخلاصة أخص الخواص من مكاشفات والمشاهدات السرية والمعاينات الروحية. ولكل واحد من الملك والملكوت مدركات يدرك بها لا غير، لأن الوجدانيات والذوقيات لا تسمها ألسنة العبارات لأنها منقطع الإشارات. فقوله لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به يشير إلى عدم تعبيره بلسان الظاهر عن أسرار الباطن والحقائق إلى آخره. It's a very fascinating passage. He's saying that in everything there is mulk and malakut. And I don't know if some of you have heard, well, I know that some of you have heard my mulk and malakut tapes. And he says, but the Quran itself has mulk and malakut. And the parts of the Quran that have to do with mulk are all the narratives in the Quran that have to do with laws, the do's and don'ts. But the malakut, but the parts of the Quran that have to do with malakut are the deeper meanings that regulate our relationship to the divine. In fact, our relationship to our very selves. And for that, different methods are required that in dealing with these than in dealing with the mulk in the Quran. I have a whole, I mean, I've given lectures on the idea of mulk and malakut, but okay, but let's go back. Okay, so then the warning that not to speed on the Quran and to reflect on the Quran. So keep that in mind because we're going to come back to it. How does that fit in? After saying ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانَهُ, we must in fact digest the meaning of the Quran. Allah then shifts gear again and says كلا بل تحبون العاجلة وتذرون الآخرة. Verily, you have a bad habit. And what is your bad habit is that you're drawn to the immediate, to this life. And that you tend to ignore the long term, al-akhirah, the other life. And then say, وجوه يومئذ ناظرة إلى ربها ناظرة. This is 22 and 23. Yeah. Faces that day shall be radiant, gazing upon their Lord, and faces that day shall be scowling, knowing that a spine-crushing calamity will befall them. وجوه يومئذ ناظرة إلى ربها ناظرة ووجوه يومئذ باسرة تظن أن يفعل بها فاقرة. So then read the Quran carefully, ponder the Quran, know that you have a tendency to focus on the immediate, on this world, and to overlook the next. But keep in mind that the day will come that there will be radiant faces gazing upon its Lord. And there will be basara, stressed out faces. That's the busur. Busur is when you're not scowling, but you're sort of stressed out, and your eyebrows are wrinkled, and you're stressed. تظن أن يفعل بها فاقرة. The reason that they said spine crushing is it's a literal translation of faqira. And when we talk about the backbone, it's called al-amud al-faqri because it's made of fuqur. But تظن أن يفعل فاقرة is something that idiomatically is when you feel that a big disaster is going to befall you that will crush your bones, not literally but figuratively, that's a faqra. So for instance, we call poverty faqr because it's bone crushing. Because poverty is bone crushing. So when you say تظن أن يفعل بها فاقرة, it's like saying, you know, I just feel I'm in big trouble. كلا إذا بلغت التراقي وقيل من راق وظن أنه الفراق والتفت الساق بالساق إلى ربك يومئذ المساق. Some of the most powerful Quranic descriptions of death. كلا إذا بلغت التراقي. كلا إذا بلغت التراقي, I don't like the translation, nay, but when it reaches the collarbones. كلا إذا بلغت التراقي is like when you get to that point that as you are nearing the end, there's as if a gulp in your throat. Now that gulp is not necessarily physiological, but it's the apprehension. It's like, if you've ever been near death, you know exactly what it's talking about. I felt it when I had my heart attack. It's like, is this it? وَقِيلَ مَنْ رَاقٍ. وَقِيلَ مَنْ رَاقٍ. You start wondering whether any medicine, any treatment is going to help. That's idiomatically وَقِيلَ مَنْ رَاقٍ is. You and the people around you. You start frantically saying, is there anything we can do? وَظَنَّ أَنَّهُ الْفُرَاقِ. And then it starts dawning on you that this is really the end. وَالْتَفَّتِ السَّاقُ بِالسَّاقِ. Now that's one of the most remarkable expressions in the Arabic language, period. Because literally it means the legs became like intertwined. That's the literal meaning. So in the literal meaning, if you've ever washed bodies that are dead, I've noticed that in fact a lot of with cadavers, their legs are crossed. You know, I don't know why, but maybe doctors can answer that. But that's not that's just the sort of the literal meaning. But التفت الساق بالساق, and I'll just read this quote and then I'll explain. أي التفت شدة مفارقة الدنيا ولذاتها وشدة الذهاب، أو التفت شدة ترك الأهل وترك الولد وترك المال وترك الجاه وشدة شماتة الأعداء وغم الأولياء. بالجملة فالشدائد هناك كثيرة كشدة الذهاب إلى الآخرة والقدوم على الله، أو التفت شدة ترك الأحباب والأولياء وشدة الذهاب إلى دار الغربة. So, what التفت الساق بالساق idiomatically means when one hardship becomes intertwined upon another. And what are these hardships? The hardships of realizing that you're leaving your family, that you're leaving your material possessions, that you're confronting the unknown, whatever fears might befall you and anxieties might befall you at these last moments, whatever you might see at these last moments, also, وَالْتَفَّتِ السَّاقُ بِالسَّاقِ means that what becomes intertwined is one foot in earthly life and one foot in the hereafter. So you are now in that process in between. You are transitioning. So at that point, there's a dilemma. فلا صدق ولا صلى ولكن كذب وتولى ثم ذهب إلى أهله يتمطى. What is the dilemma? You haven't prayed, you haven't given charity, you in fact lived in doubt and turned away often, and you went to your support system. ذهب إلى أهله يتمطى. Usually people translate it as went. Here the study Quran says, then went to his people swaggering. Al-Tamati is literally like stretching like this. That's Tamati. Like, and what it means is that you were in your support group feeling comfortable and safe. It doesn't necessarily mean swagger. It just means you felt entitled. So you didn't pray, you didn't give to charity, you often turned away, but through it all, you had an attitude. And what is the attitude? You felt entitled. I'm okay. I have time. Don't talk to me about this stuff now. Yeah, I know. I should be better. I should pray, yeah, I've heard it. Okay, thank you. You feel that is what it's alerting to you to. Okay. Then comes this very interesting Quranic expression, أولى لك فأولى ثم أولى لك فأولى. The study Quran translates it as then nearer to you and nearer. أولى لك فأولى it's like saying idiomatically, it's like saying now you've done it, now you've done it. It's not like nearer to you, but okay, now you've done it. There's no escape. You've really screwed it up. If we really want to be idiomatic. So you've really messed it up. You've really done it this time. أَيَحْسَبُ الْإِنسَانُ أَن يُتْرَكَ سُدًى. Do you really think that there is a creator that would create and then not have consequences? ألم يكن نطفة من مني يمنى ثم كان علقة فخلق فسوى فجعل منه الزوجين الذكر والأنثى أليس ذلك بقادر على أن يحيي الموتى. Was it not that you were semen emitted, then you became a blood clot, then you were created and fashioned from a blood clot into either male or female. Don't you think that the creator of all of this is capable of bringing you back so that the existence you've had will have meaning? Okay, so now let's go back for Surah Al-Qiyamah. In my view, it truly, I mean, all indications that it had an enormous spiritual effect on the early Muslim community. It warns you. Now you understand why those who said the Qiyamah could either be the day of resurrection or the day of death, because it talks about the day of death. But it also has a reference there about reading the Quran very carefully and reflecting upon it. And if you reflect upon it, it is in this short surah layering major psychological pitfalls. You could have a conscientious self that looks at its own faults, and then you are on a good trajectory to have a different type of qiyamah, the qiyamah of enlightenment. The key to enlightenment before death is the ability to see your own faults to the exclusion of the faults of others. If you see your own faults, yeah, I see my own faults, but I also see the faults of others. No enlightenment. If, well, you know, I know I have problems, but other people are much worse, forget it. Enlightenment requires a nafsul lawama that sees its own faults to the exclusion of others. It doesn't care who's worse or who's better. It understands its relationship to Allah, and it has a sense of shame about its relationship with Allah. Allah, others might be much worse, I don't care. But I love you. And I care about how I feel about you. And what you feel about me. And there's another psychological pitfall. If you think you've got time, well, I'm tired today, I'll do it tomorrow. Well, this year it doesn't work for me, next year I'll try. Well, this Ramadan it didn't really work, I spent this Ramadan watching Egyptian musalsals. Next Ramadan I'll spend my time praying and doing ibadah. Huge pitfall. If you ponder the Quran carefully, then you see that the Quran is telling you, then you will not have the Yawm al-Qiyamah in the sense of enlightenment. And then when the Qiyamah comes of iltaffat as-saq bil-saq, that day of death, yours is going to be one filled with anxiety. Because you don't know where you're going. Or what the consequences of what will happen will be. And then the day of resurrection, note, in this surah, Allah intentionally doesn't talk about heaven and hell. Allah simply says, you're coming to me. Now, grow up and think about that. Now, note precisely what I explained about your relationship to the divine. So here's a typical sample text of exactly the type of thing that I'm describing. Hold on. Okay, so he says, or maybe it is in one of his isharas. Okay. لا وصول إلى سعادة لقاء الله في الآخرة إلا بتحصيل محبته والأنس به في الدنيا، ولا تحصل المحبة إلا بالمعرفة، ولا تحصل المعرفة إلا بدوام الفكر، ولا يحصل الأنس إلا بالمحبة ودوام الذكر، ولا تتيسر المواظبة على الذكر إلا بإقلاع حب الدنيا من القلب، ولا يقع ذلك إلا بترك لذات الدنيا وشهواتها، ولا يمكن ترك المشتهيات إلا بقمع الشهوات، ولا تنقمع الشهوات بشيء كما تنقمع بنار الخوف المحرقة للشهوات. So, because it is a very important quote, I'll translate it. So he says, if you want to understand what this surah wants you to do, it wants you, for your heart, to turn away from the falsity, from false existence. But that cannot happen unless you actually feel happiness about meeting Allah. But that cannot in turn happen unless you are able to love Allah and feel Allah's company in earth, in your life on earth. But you cannot fall in love with Allah and feel Allah's company in your earthly life except with ma'rifah, with knowledge. But knowledge itself cannot take place except with dawam al-fikr, when you think about Allah for long periods of time. ولا يحصل الأنس إلا بالمحبة ودوام الذكر. But that in itself cannot occur without dawam al-dhikr, without engaging in long dhikr. ولا تتيسر المواظبة على الذكر. But you cannot engage in long dhikr unless you are able to detach your heart from so many of the pleasures of life. Because time, it's always a choice. It's either you spend your time doing something fun or you do dhikr. And it says, but you're not going to be able to detach from the pleasures of life unless بقمع الشهوات, unless you learn to control your impulses and desires. But you do not control your impulses and desires unless you learn to fear Allah's punishment. It's a remarkable passage, all from Surah Al-Qiyamah, and it's fairly representative. One last thing, also about Surah Al-Qiyamah. Because our ancestors used to take the Quran far more seriously than we do, and I always keep saying that, they developed reflecting and studying, because Surah Al-Qiyamah told them, don't rush through the Quran, read it carefully and reflect upon it, which is exactly what they did. So they reflecting upon the Quran and reflecting upon what it said, they said, well, there are 4 gradations of a nafs. Related to nafs al-lawama. There is a nafs al-ammariya. I'll explain them in a second. النفس اللوامية, النفس الملهمة, والنفس المطمئنة. النفس الأمارية is the most primitive form of your nafs. It's the nafs that commands you to want and to fulfill the want without further ado. You must work to get that nafs to become a nafs lawamiyya. A nafs lawamiyya is, it still commands you to want and to fulfill what you want, but it at least has a conscience about it. So it will often go back and hold you accountable and say, why did you do this? Why did you do that? And now, but then you must work towards, from that, going to an-nafs al-mulhima. An-nafs al-mulhima is the nafs that actually, instead of propelling you to want and to fulfill your want, inspires you to elevate through love. Not physical love, but real love. It calls upon you to say, true fulfillment is in love. And yes, the theologians say love of your children, love of your family, but most of all, love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you are able to fill your life with the understanding of love, to all the healthy things that you should love, love of your neighbors, love of your friends, love of your family, love of Allah, you elevate to an-nafs al-mutma'inna, the serene self. Whole discourse, I mean, again, I'm summarizing a very long discussion and a very nuanced discussion, all inspired by Surah Al-Qiyamah. May we take the Quran as seriously as our ancestors did. They built a civilization and we've built nothing. Inshallah, if we do take it as seriously as they did, I think we will build a civilization. Inshallah. Okay, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. And this is Surah Al-Qiyamah.
Assalamu alaikum. Okay, ready to get started again. So, thank you again. For those who didn't hear a bit of my introduction, I was really praising the Arab Women's Book Club. We have a couple of joiners with us on the interactive group. It was an incredible session, and the professor was just telling me that you guys should also consider reading Speaking in God's Name next. We have like a whole laundry list of things that are good for women. Tell them why? Oh, because it's all about women's issues, and it's extremely empowering. And
Tell them to skip the first section of the book.
you can tell them, they can hear you.
Okay, skip the first section of the book that has a philosophical introduction to Islamic jurisprudence, and just go directly to the section that deals with the fatwa that are demeaning towards women, and the way I analyze these fatwa. Because I take a bunch of fatwa that were very deprecating towards women, and I demonstrate that these fatwa are nonsense.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. So start from chapter 6. Don't read all the stuff in the beginning.
Actually, there's the interlude.
Relax.
Intro.
Okay.
Everybody is
so
commenting on where you should start.
The introduction and chapters, and then jump to chapter 6.
I think you should just read the whole book.
No.
It's
I was
incredible.
gonna say
Introduction
I couldn't even do that with reasoning with God. Like we kept thinking that it was a very heavy read. But at the same time, like we all said, like there's little gems in every section.
There's
You
there
don't
are little
want to
gems
miss
in
the gems.
every section. You can't miss it.
She
But
doesn't
I
wanna
think-
miss the gems.
Yeah, you don't want to miss the gems. I think it's just it's more challenging maybe in the beginning. So if you jump to chapter 6 and start there, and then go back, and then
Okay.
maybe it's a little bit more digestible that way. But it's hard anyway. Yeah,
But these are smart women, so they can.
super smart women. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
they're
really,
scary
really
smart.
cool. Woman power.
Intimidating women.
So, okay, well, I mean, on that note, alhamdulillah, thank you again for, this was an incredible, Surah, I don't know why you thought you
Yeah.
didn't do a good job. I mean, I think
What's
everyone
up
here
with
is like
that?
upset. Yeah, like, what's up with that? But it's the shaitani attacks that come in.
Devil
So,
attacks.
devil attacks, yeah. Okay, so who would like to lead with a question?
Sharif?
I mean, I should definitely not go first.
Ramin,
I'll
go
ask
for
a
it.
I have a
Oh,
quick
okay.
one.
Go for it.
Maybe you could help elaborate on understanding how to differentiate between a nafs al-lawwama versus a demonic waswas, and how they can kind of sometimes intermingle or be used in a way to hurt.
Well, okay. I mean,
Let me summarize the question here.
the question is that like a nafs al-muwaswisa, the one that has a compulsive self-doubt as opposed to a healthy sense of my mother worked in mental health, as you guys know, and she would often come home and educate us about all types of patients. Of course, without telling us who the patients were, but just the so that we learn. And the one thing I remember about like people with waswasa is that it was it was an obsessive and not necessarily even obsessive doubt about the self, but obsessive doubt about certain obsessive things that they become fixated on. Can self-doubt, can a nafs al-lawwama undermine itself? In other words, engage in self-flagellation, where it's simply punishing itself, deconstructively rather than constructively? Absolutely yes. The main difference is that if lawm is not to say I am a bad person, but rather to say I committed an error. It is only Allah that has the power and the legitimacy to say whether the ultimate judgment, are you a good person or a bad person. وَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ. Don't commend yourself. You only evaluate your actions. This was a good action, this was a bad action, and repeatedly you take it back to Allah. Allah, if I'm right that this was something bad, then let me see it very clearly and forgive me and guide me something better. Allah, if this is truly something good, then help me believe that it's good, or appreciate its goodness and reward me for it and help me become even better. So it is the fact that everything is directed towards Allah, not simply a process of self-judgment. So when someone comes and says, they give me a long list of their faults, and I am this and I am this and I am this and I just all things. But And a lot of the things have to do with undermining their ability to move forward, not hold themselves accountable. So, for instance, people it says things about how they're not good at school and they're horrible students and they just can't do this. And I say, are you repenting for anything, or is just you're punching yourself, using yourself as a punching bag? Because if you're not repenting for something, then don't involve God in this. This is not about the nafs al-lawwama. Nafs al-lawwama is about saying, I'm sorry to Allah, and believing that Allah can make you better. So even in school, if I had some guy who came to me, said, I want you to know that I'm a sophomore and I've cheated throughout my freshman year and sophomore year. And I said, well, if you're saying this to say that you're a loser and you should drop out of school, then I have nothing to say to you. But if you're saying this to say that you're really sorry and that you believe and trust in Allah, that Allah can help you if with sincere and clean efforts to become a good student, then I'm with you. I think that is,
Sorry, I didn't set up the long cord.
No, it's hi. Amazing lecture as usual. I don't know why you keep feeling like otherwise. It was incredible. But I would kind of just be interested to hear more on the teaching of enlightenment as the ability to see one's own faults, particularly with the exclusion of noticing the faults of others. So my question is, how did the early Muslims put this teaching into effect? For one example, they might have saw other Muslims in the Ummah struggling with their own faults, but wanted to also seek the fulfillment of love that you talked about, of seeking love through, or of seeking the higher self through fulfillment of love with friends and others. Kind of like, so where does, I guess, the nuance come in of enlightenment of seeking one's own faults with the exclusion of others, versus also attaining and fulfilling love for other people, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, if we take, there was a communal context to this, because one of the things that we also know right away that the Prophet ﷺ practiced with the Sahaba is to, what the Quran emphasizes, that Muslims are brothers and sisters, and that the idiom "Uhibbuka fillah," I love you in God, was something that they would repeat very often to each other. But it becomes a form of hypocrisy if you say it and then you are keeping a tab of other people's faults and speaking about their faults behind their backs. And that the Prophet ﷺ, when he would catch them doing that, because they were human and they would err, he would always call this jahili practice from the days of ignorance. It's I don't. I was raised, for instance, that with my parents, that it was bad manners to notice the faults of my parents. And I was taught that this is inconsistent with love. That I should focus on my own faults and not think about the ways that my parents are not. And I also was taught to do the same with my siblings. And because I was taught to do that with my parents and I was taught to do that with my siblings, it was not that hard to extend it to people that then became part of people I thought of as Muslim sisters and brothers. What is difficult is that when you find that this type of ethical practice is not that widespread, so it's not reciprocated, then you tend to withdraw. I would rather withdraw than commit the sin of think of all the ways other people are, and it's people that, and I mean, it's one thing when I am doing my job and I'm you know, I'm not talking about evaluating students, which I do all the time. And evaluating students, you have to take note of their intellectual mistakes, but that's very different than when you are noticing the faults of people, so you can think ill of them, or that you can feel superior to them, or you can feel better than them. That's unhealthy. I mean, and it's unhealthy for the person who does it. I mean, often the people you do it to don't even know you're doing it, and they're oblivious to it. But it eats away at your soul. It in so many ways, and it also invites a lot of demonic influences. I mean, I often don't talk about that, so I don't freak people out. But in the same way that major sins invite demons, ugliness in the soul invites demons.
Any other questions? I see that a couple of the interactive questions, I think we addressed these. If anyone who submitted questions wanted further clarification, go ahead and send it through the chat, but I think we addressed those.
I have a question.
Can I ask one before you get into that?
Okay.
Okay.
Be smart.
I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the serene self, the last level.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much to say about it because it's layers and gradations, right? I mean, it's not. You've experienced one of those selves, my mother, so you've actually observed an example of that. Mudarisi would be another example of it. But it is. The key to it, I think, is that it has truly accepted that whatever comes from God or is taken away from God is all good because it's from God. And so it is at peace with the world. I've never seen a serene self that is judgmental of others. And I've never seen a serene self that is not introspective. All serene selves are the first to notice their own faults and the first to feel bad about their own mistakes. No one is immune from mistakes. But serene selves shine, the best way to put it is that they shine peace and beauty unto others. You know, you just love being in their presence. They're like a beacon of, and the other thing that you, like the people you've met that are like that, they go out of their way because life on earth is not worth much to them in the first place, it takes a lot to be able to come into friction with them. I mean, they just, it's not important enough for them to come into friction with anyone. But the key, it all emerges from an understanding of a mizan. I mean, that is really what if you want, what clicks inside of a soul, is that they understand the way that the balance of the world works. And they even understand the way that the balance between evil and good works. And they even understand the very intuitively, even if not philosophically. My mother never understood it philosophically, but she did it intuitively. That why evil exists, when it exists, so that she is at the same time was always appreciative of beauty as it existed. That's the serene self. It is the earmark of a serene self is wisdom, is hikmah. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whoever is given wisdom is given a great gift. I believe that that type of serenity, ultimately, it's a barakah. It's an actual gift from Allah. It's not something just that you create. It's something that you work towards, and then Allah comes to a point and says, "Okay, you've earned it. I'm giving it to you." Hamid al-Ghazali, by the way, writes in his Ihya Ulumuddin a lot about that.
Sharif has a question.
Okay. So this has happened multiple times, and I'm glad that this happened with halfway through the halaqah, so I could have some time to think about it. Because originally, when this happened, it happened halfway through, and I felt incredulous and wanted to, during Q&A, jump on here and give a public service announcement. But in the live stream on the chat,
You should.
and this has happened multiple times. This is common. It seems like ethics kind of go out the window, because if people were here in person, they would not be having these kind of conversations. But I'm bringing it up because within the context of the surah, this is extremely relevant. But halfway through, a debate took place about hijab. And so, I mean, first of all, I'd like to point out that the previous halaqah, we discussed this at the beginning, so it might be useful for those watching to go look at that. And there's also an upcoming publication on hijab that would be good to look at if you want to learn more about it. But the irony of it being that this surah was about looking at other people's faults. But then I thought about it and I'm like, well, I'm looking at their faults and I want to jump in and call them out on it. So my question is, especially for other Muslims, with those that were engaged in this process, and number one, is there a difference between noticing someone else's faults and it being like a source of beating them down? Or, and the second part of it is, when and is it okay? I mean, is it, because I feel like to some extent, if you see someone being unconscious about certain actions, do you call their attention to it? Because there's also the whole element of standing for truth.
Well, okay. No, I think the right thing is to bring it to the teacher, but not tell the teacher who is doing what. I have no interest in knowing who was discussing this or that. the reason that you bring it to the teacher is not because of the issue of the hijab, it's because of the issue of adab al-ta'allum. The studying has an adab, and the adab of studying is when the teacher who, if they're a real teacher, they spend years and years and years studying and years preparing material. You know, you get whatever the fruit of 30 years, 40 years in an hour or 2 hours. The dars, all that must transpire in the dars must be limited to the dars.
Can you translate that word?
Dars, lesson, the class. You know, the American type of thing that sometimes I see law students do, and if I catch them, you know, there's hell to pay. Like, you know, surfing the net while I'm teaching, or texting each other. You know, if I catch them, I throw a fit. But in an Islamic context, I don't throw a fit. I just say, you know, the adab of
Etiquette.
the etiquette of teaching is that you listen, and you speak when you are given permission to speak, and so having a side debate about anything is not Islamic adab. It's just not. It's disrespectful to the teacher. It's disrespectful to the material. I don't care what the topic is. You can have the debates outside the class, but within the class. And same thing, by the way. I mean, even more with the khutbah, because the Prophet ﷺ said, any side, anything negates your khutbah. I mean, negates your Jum'ah. That is even more serious. But let's stay with the dars. So that's you know, I don't care what the merits of what the points are, or I don't think anything about Surah Al-Qiyamah had to do with the hijab. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that, and I know that it gets confusing because you know, modern technology has cursed us with but it is the equivalent of being in a class and writing notes to each other. You know, like the old system when you would write a note and pass it to the student. Well, it's the same thing, but just because we do it electronically, it doesn't change the qualitative nature of the act. And if you're a teacher and you notice people passing notes, then you stop the class, you say, give me that note. And then you look at the note and you read it to everyone and embarrassed, you know. And then, you know, the demons of modern technology have made that impossible to do, because you have to pace around the class and see, you know, spy at people's screens, and then if you find the screen that's, you know, then you stop the class, you say, you know, what is this? And I can't do that in the halaqah. I don't have the health to pace around, and even if I paced around, it wouldn't help because this is done electronically. So we have to rely on adab. That's it. That's the bottom line. So does that answer?
Yeah, and I mean, the other part of the question is this contextual? Is this just an internal thing of whether I'm looking at other people's faults as a personality? Or is this also a commentary that if you see someone doing wrong, or you see someone locked in unconscious behavior, then is there a responsibility on you to speak to them? And is it about the intention with which that you speak to them?
Well, of course, if you are a part of a class and there is an ethical conduct to that class, there is a code of conduct, and all students are deputized to uphold the code of conduct and to enforce it. So it is appropriate to say to a person, this is against the code of conduct, please stop, or I'm going to have to bring it to the teacher's attention. And it's not, you're not doing it because you think low of them, or because you think there's anything faulty about them, or because you don't respect them, but because the institution has to be respected. I don't know if why the discussion in the first place, whether it's directed at someone or not. Of course, if it's directed at someone, it's the type of thing that we're talking about. But this is not the forum for an intellectual debate about hijab, because this is not the topic that we are discussing in this particular halaqah. And because the teacher didn't say, I am now giving you a platform for an open discussion about the merits of that, or about the substantive issue. So, classes, it's like this. If you work in an institution, there are rules because we have to learn that just because we're in Islam, it doesn't mean that we can throw the rules out. That's wrong. You are in an institutions, there is a code of conduct that governs everything. If you are in a medical practice, there's a code of conduct. If you're in a legal practice, there's a code of conduct. If you're in a corporate practice, there's a code of conduct. Well, in Islamic education, there's a code of conduct. And that's it. And so it's not that you are engaging in personal attacks on anyone. You are just simply enforcing the code of conduct for an Islamic education. That should be, you don't think, and you must, you must avoid any implication that, oh, you're a horrible person because you've done that. It's just, this is just against the code of conduct, so we have to stop it, that's all. It's like against the rules. It's like, someone can't walk in here with a beer in hand. I'd throw them out against the code of conduct. It's nothing personal to you guys, but you just can't do that.
Okay. Any other questions in here?
Although having a discussion about that is not really it's not like the same thing, but anyway.
Okay, one more question. Since the doctor mentioned the creation of evil and the serene self, can you recommend a reference to comprehend the reason behind the creation of evil and tragedies? Because I know people struggling with their relationship with the divine because of that old argument, and they've read different things but are still not convinced.
There is a good book that discusses, but it's written from a philosophical perspective. Do they want a book of philosophy? Islamic philosophy perspective. It's rather dense. It's a discussion about what Muslim philosophers said about what evil is. If you want something, yeah, it's on the reading list. I can find it. I just can't remember its name right now.
Which reading list?
The reading list that I gave you for Usuli.
Oh, okay. So it's on, so maybe I can give a plug to bookshop.org. We actually have a list of all the recommended books from the professor within the Islamic context. You can actually buy books there, and Usuli gets a portion of
These are all the
benefits
books
too.
that I read in English about Islam, and I recommend.
Would that be in the philosophical section?
It would be in the philosophy, but I can find the exact title. if that's what they want. If they want something less philosophical, because that's pretty dense, I would recommend the vision of Islam as more accessible by Shittik and Murata. It's more accessible, less philosophically oriented, but it and I'll tell you, we can leave that for another topic. Evil is the absence of good. Allah doesn't create evil. Allah only creates good. And when we fail to embrace the good that Allah creates, that's how evil is created. I know that if you haven't heard this before, you'd say, what? But we can talk about that some other time. But it's like, is darkness created or is light created? And I would argue that actually it's only light that's created. Darkness is simply the absence of light. Darkness is not created. That's the type of thing that's the type of discourse that you would read in great detail in the philosophically oriented, the book that discusses Muslim philosophers. But if you want a more user-friendly, then Shittik and Murata, The Vision of Islam, is a good source.
You don't remember the name of the first book you were referring to, right?
I can't, but I can look it up easily.
Okay.
Eric Holmesby.
Which one?
Eric Holmesby.
Yeah.
Eric Holmesby. Okay,
Yeah,
so the
that's
author is Eric Holmesby.
Holmesby. O-R-M.
It's called Theodicy in
Ormsby.
Islamic Thought.
Sorry?
Theodicy in Islamic Thought.
Theodicy in Islamic Thought.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
That's it.
Theodicy in Islamic Thought.
By Eric Ormsby.
Okay.
Ormsby. Y.
Why? And again, the bookshop.org is the bookshop.org/usuli, and you'll find all the books that the professor recommends that he read. Okay. I think that's it. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay. So thank you again so
Okay,
much.
thank you everyone.
Have a wonderful rest of the week, and inshallah we'll see you on Saturday at 3 o'clock Eastern. Oh, actually, maybe 4. We're gonna actually have to, we might relook the time since we're getting close to Ramadan. So I'll send an email out on my weekly email. Also, if you haven't subscribed to the Usuli weekly email, you can just go to the website and sign up there, and you'll get a weekly summary of what we've done and some musings from me.
And get more of the Harvard people to join.
Okay, yes, get more of the Harvard Book Club people to join.
I was gonna ask, are you guys comfortable with me telling more people to join?
Well, yeah, absolutely. For the interactive group, we ask that people join. So we can see them too. But we have also the other option is YouTube, which is live stream. And so if sometimes people can't make it or they're not comfortable being on the screen, absolutely, the more people that can join us, the better. So please do spread the word. That would be fabulous. Okay.
I will, inshallah. And then the other question I had was, can you repeat the title of the book that she recommended us to read?
Speaking in God's name, Islamic law, authority, and women. Inshallah.
Okay.
Women is in the title.
Thank you so much.
Wait, do you remember the Ghazali book you recommended to? It was in Arabic. What was that?
Yeah, Ulum ad-Din.
But that's been translated into English. Yeah, it's the what is it called? The sciences.
Revival of the
Islamic sciences.
Got it.
By Al-Ghazali. It's a whole series. It's a fabulous book. Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody. See you soon.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much.
Take care.